We have 3 presentations now, starting with Mike Beneduce, who will introduce the Blaufränkisch Movement in New Jersey, which is a bit of a surprise, but let's see. Mike, welcome to the stage. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a bit of a surprise for me to be here too. In Sevenia, sort of breaking bread with the kings and queens of Blaufränkisch. We have a very limited experience with the grape, but I'm happy to share our experience that we've had so far, the experience in my region, and maybe a bit about the perspective or the perception of Blaufränkisch from the American consumer side. So the first answer to the question I know you're all thinking is yes, we do grow Blaufränkisch in the United States. Most of our wine regions really are located on the coasts. So on the West Coast, obviously you have California. California produces about 90% of the volume of wine produced in the United States. So by volume and quantity, they're far and above, the leaders. Above that, you have Oregon and Washington. Washington is all the way up northwest. They actually had some of the earliest plantings of Blaufränkisch in the United States. Back in the 60s and 70s, they were starting to experiment with the grape. It really started to catch on during those years. Unfortunately, in the last decade or two, they're starting to rip out Blaufränkisch in favor of Cabernet Sauvignon, which breaks my heart to see. I was out there and talking with the producers, and they don't like it either. They love Blaufränkisch. The wine quality is very high there. The problem is economics, and so they're starting to realize that they can plant Cabernet Sauvignon in a lot of these vineyards where Blaufränkisch was previously grown, and they can get 70 or 80 euros for Cabernet Sauvignon and 30 or 40 euros for Blaufränkisch, and so for them it's a hard decision to keep those vines in. On the East Coast, we have a much less developed wine region. New York is sort of the center of the wine trade in the United States, so we have an exceptionally developed market there. A very educated consumer, people have money, they want to spend money on quality wine. The local wine movements are still young and emerging, and part of that comes from Prohibition, which was about 100 years ago. America had the very silly concept that we could survive without alcohol. It did not work out very well for us, but one of the sort of aftermath of that effect was that the laws in New Jersey and a few of the states surrounding prohibited the growth of the wine industry. They actually limited the licenses of wineries in our state to 1 winery for every 1 million people. And we have about 8 or 9 million people in our state of New Jersey, so there were only 8 wineries up until the 1980s. Finally, they had the good sense to change that law, and really since then, we've seen quite a fast explosion of vineyards planting and wineries. We're blessed to have a lot of European influence, obviously, on the East Coast, especially in New Jersey. You see a lot of Italian, Portuguese, and German influence. And so we have this historical and generational knowledge of how to make wine. It's just, how do we grow the grapes in this area? That's a new question for us a bit. So I think first to mention, Blaufränkisch has really come into the minds of sort of, I'll call it the New York sommelier, which is sort of the gatekeeper to the American wine industry, similar to our region in terms of all of those things, climate, soil. And so we started with a few varieties like Blaufränkisch, Riesling, some of those varieties from sort of the Northern European swath. You can see here the average temperatures in Clinton, which is where we're from, New Jersey, and the average temperatures in Eisenstadt, Austria. Very similar trajectory. We get warmer a bit earlier, and we stay warmer a bit later, but we still have that diurnal shift. We still have a very cool nighttime temperature, which allows us to maintain that crisp acidity in the wines. And you can see the winter minimums are very similar. So this was something particularly that I was looking for when we were comparing regions was, some of these areas in Italy where we might have similar temperatures to, they don't get below 0 or 10 degrees in the winter. There's no way that those grapes are going to survive in our climate. We also looked at precipitation. So on the top you have rainfall where I am, rainfall in Eisenstadt. We have a bit more consistent precipitation, and we have a bit more overall precipitation, but the trajectory is still fairly similar to Austria. And then if you look at the growing degree days on the bottom two charts, that again is the accumulation of heat. It's really almost identical to Burgenland in terms of tracking that total accumulation of heat. So this gave us the sort of idea that these Austrian grapes, particularly Blaufränkisch, should work in our climate. And so we planted them in 2009. While the grapes were young and maturing, I said, no one around here knows what they're doing with Blaufränkisch. I better go figure out how to handle this variety. And so I took a trip with my wife to Burgenland back in 2012. And the Austrian producers were incredibly gracious, opened their doors to us, spent entire days, which as a farmer and a winemaker, I know how valuable that time is, so I really appreciate that. And this is me walking with Anton Ibi, and we just met really some of the top producers in the country. Really got a sense of the wide stylistic range that Blaufränkisch has, how they're handling it in the vineyard, and really came back with the idea that this really could be a special variety for us. So for us, in terms of our entire vineyard, Blaufränkisch as a variety generally buds the earliest. So this can be a little bit of a challenge for spring frost issues. We do have spring frost where we are. I've actually had to hire helicopters 2 years ago that fly over the vineyards, and they push the warm air down to mix the air up, and that can help during the spring frost nights. And it's also the latest ripening variety. So as we get into the fall, if we start to have fall rainstorms, that can also be a challenge because that can obviously dilute the concentration of the grapes. Another challenge we have is downy mildew, plasmopara, which is a mildew that affects the leaves, the canopies. I'm not sure if do you have that here in Slovenia? Yeah? Yeah. So anytime you have humidity, I guess that's an issue. So that can be quite an issue for us. But the saving grace of Blaufränkisch in our area is the fruit is bulletproof compared to the other varieties that we're growing. It's a looser cluster, it's a smaller berry, and it's a much thicker skin, especially compared to varieties like Riesling and Pinot Noir that we're also focused on. So we find that even in the wettest, most humid, challenging years, the fruit never rots. It never gets botrytis. It never has issues with allowing it to hang into maturity. So that's really a key in our region because that's the main challenge, is allowing the fruit enough time to mature on the vine before it rots. We also really like how it grows. It's sort of very perky and upright, and some varieties that we grow tend to be a bit more drooping. And so my vineyard crew loves working with it because when they're hedging, it's just very easy to manage. It looks really manicured. Larger leaves, so we're doing leaf removal in the cluster zone to expose the grapes to some direct sunlight. And with those larger leaves, you pull one and it exposes a large area of that cluster zone where something like Gewürztraminer, you have to pull 10 little leaves in the same area. So, and as I mentioned earlier, very cold hardy. So this is really a key benefit for our area. So across New Jersey, and again, it's a small region. It's actually about the size of Slovenia. As you have here, obviously a diversity of soil and climates. So across New Jersey, we really, from north to south, have quite a bit of diversity in soil types. In the north where we are, it's much more rolling hills, deep clay loams, shale soils. As you move down towards the south, it tends to get flatter and more sandy soils, better drainage, but they also have much warmer nights, and so they have problems sometimes maintaining that freshness of acidity that works with some varieties. They have had success with Blaufränkisch because the grape itself just has a great, beautiful backbone of acidity. So it's one of the few grapes that we see working across our whole region. And that's something that we're really working together to see if we can develop, because if you look at the other sort of emerging wine regions in America, like the Finger Lakes, they've sort of rallied around a single variety. Finger Lakes is known for Riesling. Oregon on the West Coast is known for Pinot Noir, and all the producers there make Pinot Noir. So we're asking ourselves, is there a variety that will work across the whole region of New Jersey that we can all sort of co-market and build a brand around? And Blaufränkisch seems to be one of the very few that has answered that problem so far. In our area, it's described as the Pinot Noir of the East. And I find that this is interesting point between Europe and America, because it's also sort of the Pinot Noir of Eastern Europe. It's highly site-specific, a beautiful freshness. It's a food pairing wine. And we see that also in the Eastern United States, that it really could be a wine or a grape that, for the slice of the American consumer that's interested in wines that are terroir-driven, it really could be quite an interesting answer to that. And it's certainly in our region, as I mentioned, the early successes that Blaufränkisch has had has gotten a lot of critical attention, really in the 10 years or 20 years that we've been working with the grape. The new producers, the new people that are planting vineyards are saying, hey, maybe there's something going on here. We should put a few hectares of Blaufränkisch in as well. So the new plantings that are going in our area, there's quite a bit of focus on Blaufränkisch, which is exciting to see. So one of the things also that I really appreciate about Blaufränkisch is that it has a wide range of wine styles. In the same way that Riesling can be made in Kabinett, Spätlese, Trockenbeer, and Auslese, you have different wine styles that can be very successful for Blaufränkisch. And one of the Austrian producers last night was talking about how for the first 25 years of the vine's life, they sort of make it like a village level wine or a basic wine, and then after that they start to get serious. Well, we've only been growing for 12 years, so all of our grapes are very young, and so we're exploring styles that are also suitable for young vines. And I think one of those is sparkling rosé. And so this is our lineup of what we call crafted series wines. They're very small volume. They're all based on Italian hand gestures. So as you can see, I talk with my hands a lot, as my whole family does. And so all of these are based on Italian hand gestures. And for our Blaufränkisch Pet Nat, which is a sparkling rosé, it's all about easy drinking. It's a fun summer wine. You know, just means let's go have a drink somewhere. And so that's sort of our rosé Pet Nat from Blaufränkisch. We pick this usually late September, so this is the earliest pass through the vineyard of our Blaufränkisch we pick for rosé sparkling. All of our whites and our rosés are whole cluster press, so we don't destem anything. We really like to maintain that whole cluster as we're extracting the juice. And then very simple fermentation in stainless steel, temperature controlled. We'd make a Pet Nat style, really because we don't have the room or the equipment to make a champagne method sparkling wine, although I think it would work well with that. But this really lends itself to a fresh, fruity interpretation of Blaufränkisch that works really well with the American consumer. They sometimes don't want to think so much about what they're drinking, they just want to have fun doing it. And this is just a perfect wine. You put this in front of them, and you can charge 40 euros a bottle for it, and they won't blink an eye, which is amazing. Quite a good product in terms of cash flow, very young to market, little aging time. Besides the extra work of hand bottling it, it has quite low inputs for us. And of course, we bottle this unfined and unfiltered. So as it's actively fermenting, as it gets down to a small amount of sugar, we bottle that under a crown cap, and then allow the wine to finish fermentation in the bottle where it was bottled, and that gives it sort of a nice low amount of carbonation, which is nice. So our second style that we make is just a dry rosé. The people that were at the dinner last night, we had one of our dry rosés earlier in the evening. Again, hand harvested, usually late September, early October. Lower sugar content, so this is usually somewhere between 11 and 12% potential alcohol. Really bright acidity in this. I mean, we want this to be refreshing and crisp. Light color, so again, a whole cluster pressing, trying not to extract too much of those phenolics, those tannins. Temperature controlled fermentation, a little bit cooler to preserve the aromatics. And then we bottle this under screw cap to really preserve that freshness. We make about 600 or 700 cases, so about 1,000 bottles of this. I'm sorry, 10,000 bottles of this every year. And around 24 or 25 euros a bottle for this. And then, of course, our flagship Blaufränkisch is a still red version, as what we're used to seeing. Generally, for us, this is the latest harvested in our vineyard. We also grow some Cabernet Franc, which is harvested in late October as well, but it's pretty similar. Those two varieties jump back and forth. We've harvested this actually the first week of November in some cooler years where we could hang the grapes. We do about a 2-day cold soak, so de-stemming the grapes, generally keeping them at very cold temperatures to extract a little bit before the fermentation starts. We generally work with native yeast in this variety, so we sort of allow that native yeast population to build a bit, and then we just allow a free rise fermentation, so allowing the wine to build its own temperature through the fermentation. We do everything in open top fermentations, about 1,000 kilograms per bin, and we do manual pigeage, punching down, so a more gentle extraction, somewhere around 2 weeks for the total maceration time. And then we go into barrel. We do malolactic fermentation in barrel. I really like to do it in barrel. I find the oak integrates a little bit better, the mallow integrates better with a bit of oxygen. After malolactic fermentation, we do 1 racking, and then maybe 1 racking every year or 6 months after that. We tend to spend about 18 months in oak. Usually the first 9 months is in barrique, French barrique, 10 or 20% new barrels, so a small amount of new oak, but not overwhelming. And then we blend those barrels into big casks, botti, I'm not sure what you call them here, but like a 40 hectoliter cask, and we age the wine in that for the second year, just to sort of harmonize a bit. We bottle unfined and unfiltered generally, and we get about 40 euros a bottle for this, and we make about 6,000 bottles a year currently. So you can see we get the beautiful blue color that gives this grape its name. One of the things that has attracted me to this grape is that it's completely different every year we grow it. It is not what we call a cookie cutter grape, where it has a really consistent taste flavor profile. It really changes with the climate. And we're not in California where they have very minimal vintage variation, very consistent weather. We have different weather from year to year, as you do in Europe. And so in cooler years, we tend to get much more spicy, savory flavors, black pepper, almost like a co-roti Syrah. You get some of this black pepper aroma. Can be very smoky, like a gunflint. We had a tasting with Dr. Jose Vulamuz, who said a cold ash aroma, and which he really appreciated in the wine, and can be more in the cooler years on the sort of tart red and blue fruit spectrum. So tart blueberries, sour cherry, those types of flavors in a cool year. In a warm year, it could be quite different. Warmer spices, brown spices, Chinese 5-spice, all these sort of warmer spices. It can tend to have a prosciutto or a cured meat or sort of like a bloody steak tartare taste to it or aroma to it, which I noticed in quite a few of the Blaufränkisch last night. Maybe because we were eating prosciutto too, but. And then on the fruit side, in a warmer year, it tends to be more ripe black fruit, blackberry, plum, mulberry, loganberry, these sort of ripe forest berry fruits, which are very attractive aromas. So that's the label for our regular Blaufränkisch. As you can see, we really like to highlight the vintage on the labels. We really like to show that the vintage, the year, is the most important part of this wine. The year in which it was grown takes precedent over everything. Below that, it's the winery or the producer that's making it, and below that, it's the variety that this grape is coming from. We received some really good scores early on in our sort of marketing of Blaufränkisch. We had a 92 from James Suckling, which was at the point one of the highest scores in New Jersey from an international producer. Edible Jersey, which is sort of a regional magazine, said that our Blaufränkisch was the finest red wine made in New Jersey. And so I think that made a lot of people pay attention. Whether or not that's true, I think is totally subjective. But when somebody says that from a journalism, everyone's eyes sort of turn to you and look at you and say, like, why? Why is that? What are you doing? What's different than what we're doing? And so I think that's got a lot of consumer perception and also industry interest in this grape and why it's being successful at such an early stage in the game. So marketing Blaufränkisch certainly can be a challenge, as it is with, I'm sure, many of us. When we first opened the winery, this is what our Blaufränkisch label looked like. So my thought was, we're in New Jersey, which is a new wine region. We have to first convince people to drink local wines, And I'm going to start with my reputation on a variety that nobody's heard of. So maybe let's make it a little bit easier for the consumer to understand, or at least appreciate, or even order this grape when they come to our tasting room. And so our first label was called Blueprint, which is like an architectural drawing. Still the Blau. And so we did the blueprint of a barrel and sort of all the different barrel parts on there and put Blaufränkisch underneath that. As the consumer recognition has expanded, when we sort of redesigned our labels, we thought, well, look, if no one else is going to stand up and be a promoter of Blaufränkisch, we need to do that. We need to show the consumer that you have to learn how to pronounce this grape, first of all. And it's a grape that's interesting to grow and to drink here, and so you should become more familiar with it. So these are some of the challenges we dealt with initially was, people come into the winery looking for Pinot Grigio and Cabernet Sauvignon. And we say, well, those grapes don't really grow well in this area. But what does grow well is Blaufränkisch, because we have a very similar climate to Austria. And let's taste this. And if you like Pinot Noir, if you like Syrah, you may find that this is interesting to your palate. I think one of the bigger challenges we have is it's difficult for English speakers. As I mentioned, when we see the umlaut, everybody just doesn't want to even try to attempt to pronounce whatever word that is. And so that's obviously a learning curve for all of us. I think one of the biggest challenges, and maybe this is a challenge in Europe as well, is that there's a bit of name confusion because every region in Europe calls the grape by their own name. Whereas if you're growing Pinot Noir in Europe, you're generally calling it Pinot Noir. And so these regional names can be confusing for the consumer because they might have tasted a Lemberger, but they don't even know that that's the same grape as Blaufränkisch or as Kekfrankos or as modre frankinje. They don't understand that those are all the same varieties. And so one of my jobs when someone plants Blaufränkisch in the United States is the next day I knock on their door and we have some big guys behind me and we say, hey, you're calling this Blaufränkisch, you don't have a choice because we'll have no New Jersey Lemberger in our state. That's not going to help the cause. That's only going to fracture the market. And so we really try to educate even though new winemakers in the area that if we're going to be marketing this and branding this as an upcoming variety, we need to at least be using the same name. And so we've chosen Blaufränkisch because I think globally that has probably the most understanding from the consumer. What we have is a very unique business model. So because of the density of people in our area, we sell 100% of our wine on the farm. So everyone that's drinking my wine is coming to the farm, is walking the vineyards, often with me, is tasting in the tasting room. And so we have a really unique opportunity to educate that consumer that doesn't exist when you're putting your wine in a liquor store or a wine shop next to 1,000 bottles. Maybe the wine shop owner knows a bit about that wine and has tasted it with you, but they're not going to be able to tell the whole story of why that wine is important and why someone should be interested in it. That you are, because you have the captive audience. You have people on your soil where you're growing the grape and where you're making the wine and where you're drinking the wine. And so the people that come to our farm get this sort of full circle experience where they appreciate it as an agricultural product, they appreciate it as a gastronomic product, and they start to sort of become our disciples, and it spreads out from there. It's sort of a grassroots movement. And what we found is the next thing that we need to tackle, which we're working on now, is really what we call the industry gatekeepers. These are the people that really know wine and that decide, at least in our area, what wine is cool to drink. And this is sort of the New York sommelier, And luckily, the New York sommelier is very adventurous, and they really want to try and help consumers discover new regions and new varieties and new styles of wine that they actually appreciate drinking, rather than selling them, something that they don't want to drink or something that's expensive. They pride themselves on having obscurity on their wine list because they think, I'm showing you something that the restaurant next door is not showing you. So these are the people that we need to connect with when we're marketing Blaufränkisch. We need to have the sommelier community come out and taste with us, because when they do, like we did last night, all we're talking about is food. What food pairs with this? What food is better for this style? And that is how you sell wine in America, because generally wine is on the dinner table and we drink beer after work or during the day and a cocktail at night, but wine is generally on the dinner table. And so connecting food with wine is really important. Sort of in the United States as a whole, there's really been quite a bit of momentum on Blaufränkisch. These are some of the larger journalist magazines that we have. 750 Daily recently wrote an article that was called Blaufränkisch's Global Comeback. And this is really an industry-focused magazine, at least 1 million readers. And their subheadline was, "Plantings and quality of this native Austrian red grape are increasing, both in its home turf and in New World regions. While it's unlikely that Blaufränkisch will ever become as universal as Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon, it has established itself as more than just an obscurity, with its ability to produce high-quality, nuanced wines, even in unfavorable conditions. Expect more fine examples from Austria to the United States in the future." And so they touched on a couple key points there. One is that it can make really good wine even in unfavorable conditions, which we sometimes have on the East Coast. If you can make a high-quality wine even in a challenging vintage, you're going to have growth of that category. As I mentioned, there's sort of this idea that it's an obscure grape, and you see the Forbes article, it's the best red you've never heard of. I think that we really need to grab that concept and lean into it and run with it, because people like that right now. That's what people want, is something that they haven't tasted. So it's great to see that these articles that are coming out are talking about that. This is a wine maybe you don't know, but that you should know. So our philosophy now is fear not the umlaut. And so our winery is having its 10th anniversary this year, and we're making t-shirts that say fear not the umlaut, because we also grow Gewürztraminer, which is equally challenging for Americans to say. But it's really about leaning into this obscurity and uniqueness and distinctiveness, as previous speakers have said, of Blaufränkisch, and really being proud of that, and really wanting to show that to the consumer that's coming to taste your wine. So as I said, embracing the uniqueness of the grape and the variety, and also its ability to translate terroir. And I think terroir is a much better understood concept in Europe than it is in America. We're still sort of in the beginning stages of what we call the farm-to-table movement, where local food is sort of just a given here for Europeans, where you're going to eat what's grown and raised around you. That concept is sort of new to the American consumer, believe it or not, because we have these giant grocery stores where we have bananas from Paraguay and everything. And so eating locally is a really sort of new concept in the last few decades. Drinking locally is even newer, because a lot of these areas have not had an established wine culture or wine growing culture. And so discovering terroir is new for us. And it's one of the reasons we've chosen to plant Blaufränkisch, Riesling, and Pinot Noir as our top 3 varieties that we grow, because those grapes really have been shown to translate terroir in a very unique way. And for me, as a young winemaker and a young grower, what I want to do in my lifetime is to understand my climate and my soils and the ability of my land to produce wine. What better way to do that than with these grapes that are showcasing that in a really unique way. I think we need to lean into, again, as I said, to the food friendliness of Blaufränkisch. I mean, tasting those wines last night, it was just like every dish that was on the table, which was so beautiful, paired differently with each of the different styles. And that's a unique thing. I mean, there are a lot of big, overblown, over-oaked wines that maybe are interesting for people to just sit and have a glass of, but when you put them on the table, they don't work well with food. They're too intense. And so I think the food friendliness and the freshness and the acidity backbone of Blaufränkisch is really a key that we need to lean into. I think another thing that's heavily trending in the United States is moving away from the sort of industrialized products to more locally produced, family-owned, sustainably minded products. And this happens both in food and in beverage. And this is really taking off. And it's taking off faster than the wine scene. So we're sort of grabbing at the coattails of this movement and saying, yeah, if you're going to go to the farmer's market and shop for local peppers, also buy some local wine while you're there, because that's that's also an agricultural product, and you should be as interested in buying that locally as you are your produce. And so from what it sounds like, particularly in Slovenia, almost all of the producers are small and family-owned and artisanal, and probably have a lot of uniqueness from producer to producer. So that's something that really is attractive to the American consumer. They want to see people that care about what they're growing, people that have personality behind the products. They don't want to buy things from multinational corporations anymore. I think we've had enough of that, all of us. I think educating the consumer is really important, obviously, for this grape. You know, we have a long way to go there, but as I mentioned, it really starts with the gatekeepers, the people that already understand wine. We need to educate them about Blaufränkisch, and then they sort of trickle down from there, where they educate the consumer after that. Unless you're in a situation like us, where we have sort of a direct connection to the consumer, which again is unique, but also we try to really make the best of that opportunity. And finally, and I think this is probably the biggest thing, the American consumer today is all about the joy of discovery. When I go to a wine restaurant, I don't think I've ever picked a wine off the wine list that I've tasted before. I always want to taste something different. I want to taste something new. I want to explore a new region. I want to explore new flavors. The young, especially, generation is very adventurous in their taste profiles. And they do not want to drink, again, what their parents were drinking or what they grew up drinking. They want to drink something that's new. And so that joy of discovery is something that I think all of us can sort of lean on with a Blaufränkisch, because most people haven't had it before, or haven't had at least the style that you're offering it in before. And I think that's something that we can sort of all rally around as we develop this Pinot Noir of the East. So if you come visit, I have a German dog. He speaks German better than I can, so maybe he can translate for me. I would love to have you all. My information is here. We're on social media and all of that stuff, but honestly, if you ever come, I know some of you do tastings in New York City. We're an hour west of New York City, so if you need a place to stay, plenty of room at our place. Please join us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I think that was a very insightful story about how to succeed somewhere without tradition. And you have nothing to lean on, so you invented everything, and it looks like you did it right, so great. Any question for Mike? Yes.
Sorry, I'm abusing my privilege. It's not really a question, but some of the folks here have already heard this, sorry. A lot of people ask me why this conference, and especially why in Slovenia, right? And so I told everybody, I'm born in the state of New Jersey, the United States. My mother's family's New Jersey. Lived the first 8 years of my life in New Jersey. Used to know New Jersey inside out. I had to learn from Guillaume that there's a movement, a Blaufränkisch movement in my birth state, and I have never tasted one of the wines. So I said, that's the reason for an international Blaufränkisch conference here. Just a couple of quick marketing comments, because a lot of us are in the business of either directly selling wine, or if we're writing about it, we're basically also in that business. Just remember, this can only be the new grape on the block once.
That's right.
And we've already been around here. One story we'll tell you about the event that we put together in 2010 in New York City, and we got 2 back-to-back articles in the New York Times from Eric Asimov about how excited he was about the wines. And I mean, it did get something ignited, but you need to keep pushing the wheel. One thing that's funny about the United States, most of you will not recognize this, but there is really a movement afoot to try to nail your future as a wine-growing state to a particular grape. Finger Lakes are often used as an example. I'm involved with the conference that we do every 2 years in the Finger Lakes to try to extend the appreciation. And it's very dangerous, especially premature in most places, to try to nail your reputation to a single grape. Just ask the people who are trying to grow other grapes in the Finger Lakes. And Herman Wiemer's winery makes wonderful Blaufränkisch in the Finger Lakes. It's one of the most interesting ones that I know of outside of Europe. And one of my early assistants in the late 80s planted the first, at my suggestion, planted the first Blaufränkisch in Michigan and marketed it as Blaufränk. Anyway, but it took me 10 years to get the folks at Weimer to convince them to take Lemberger off the label and put Blaufränkisch on. Now, why? Because they were marketing the wine internally. They were selling it very well to their cellar door customers, but their distributors are saying, you can forget that. And the same problem repeated itself with Gewürztraminer. Has that umlaut. People think, oh, it's a sweet German wine, I'm not interested. The distributor said, we won't touch it. I said, it's Traminer. In the Jura, it's the most trendy grape today. But it's difficult to reconcile the markets that you have at the cellar door with the potential to promote your wine outside. And that's really where, if you have to suck it up as a non-German speaker and put Blaufränkisch on your label, just like Weissburgunder producers, if only they had all decided a long time ago to put Pinot Blanc on their label, we would be so much further in the appreciation of those wines. So just a couple of anecdotes.
Thanks, David. Do not fear the umlaut, yeah? Okay, thanks Mike, for your saying.